Yeah, the book and movie were so good, and the movie was like a mix of Sofia Coppola and David Lynch because as I was watching it, I was getting strong Twin Peaks vibes. And then Sofia Coppola has straight up said that this movie is very influential in her work specifically. Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay, published in 1967, and then the movie is directed by Peter Weir and was released in 1975. And the reason I am covering this is because someone requested it. However, I could not find who the person was. I searched my YouTube comments, I looked on Instagram, and I could not find the message of someone requesting this. And we had a back and forth. I think they were someone from Australia, and that's one of the reasons they requested it is because this takes place in Australia. So unless I dreamed the whole thing and this was this was some otherworldly experience where I thought someone requested this, but really it was something more supernatural, which would be very fitting considering it's what we're talking about. But if that's not the case, and if you're watching this and you are the one who requested it, comment down below and let me know your thoughts on my video and your thoughts on the book and movie. And yeah, thank you so much for suggesting this one because they were both fantastic. And before I get into spoilers, I just want to recommend this to everybody because yeah, the book and movie were so good, and the movie was like a mix of Sofia Coppola and David Lynch because as I was watching it, I was getting strong Twin Peaks vibes in particular, especially the pilot episode. And then Sofia Coppola has straight up said that this movie is very influential in her work. Specifically, she mentioned it was influential for the Virgin Suicides, which I do have a book versus movie for. So if that sounds like your vibe, then definitely watch this movie and then also read the book because that was so good too. It was so beautifully written and both have such an ominous feel, and they're also so ethereal and eerie and sad and weird. And I went into this knowing basically nothing, and that is what I would recommend for you as well. So if you do not know this story, stop watching this video, go read the book and or watch the movie, and then come back and hear what I have to say about it. But then I wanted to mention that there was a new remake, a miniseries made in 2018 of this. However, I'm sure it's decent, and yet I have no interest in watching it because I just don't see why this needed to be turned into a 6-hour miniseries. If you see the book, it's super short. Like, they did not need to drag this out into 6 hours. And I'm just getting tired of streaming services making these bloated series just so that they can get more of our time. And so I'm saying this without having watched it for myself, but I'm just like, I have zero interest, honestly. I'm sure it's fine, and yet I just don't feel like spending 6 hours of my time watching it. Also, I'm in the middle of reading it right now, which is over 1,000 pages long, so I would rather spend 6 hours reading that than 6 hours watching this miniseries. The movie, by the way, is under 2 hours, and the movie is fantastic. So yeah, they left out some details, and yet it's still incredible, even with those details omitted. So yeah, anyway, that's my rant on when they adapt things into a TV series that don't need to be a TV series. If they had remade it into another movie, then yeah, I would have watched that, but anyway. But from here on out, I will be getting into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward. So to begin with the basic plot overview, so a group of girls from the Appleyard College go on a picnic to Hanging Rock, and during their time there, 3 of the girls, Miranda, Marion, and Irma, who are all seniors and come from reputable families, as well as their mathematics teacher named Miss McGraw, go missing and are nowhere to be found. And 2 of the last people to have seen them are 2 men who had been there relaxing at Hanging Rock as well, a Michael Fitzherbert from England who is staying with relatives, and their coachman, Albert Crundle, who Michael has grown close to, and they had seen the girls crossing a stream but had not spoken to them. And as the story progresses, we see how the disappearance of these 4 women, how it impacts the college, the fellow students, the 2 men who had seen them, as well as just the town as a whole. And the way this impacts the town isn't something I will be getting into too much, but I did really like this aspect of both book and movie. And this kind of was reminding me of the Virgin Suicides, seeing how what happens to the Lisbon sisters, how it impacts the entire town. And they also have a similar line in both books, the Virgin Suicide book as well as Picnic at Hanging Rock. We have a line how people who knew nothing about this and who did not know the people at all are the ones acting like, oh, they know everything and they know what happened and they know the details, just like inserting themselves into a story they have nothing to do with just because it's the hot drama. But Michael, one of the men, like I said, who had been there as well, he is drawn back to the rock and he ends up finding Irma. However, she has passed out and she remembers nothing and therefore cannot give them any clues as to what has happened to the other three. And then by the end, so in the book, 3 more people associated with Appleyard College end up dying. In the movie, 2 more end up dying. But yeah, the college's reputation just keeps getting worse and worse. And in the very end, those 3 women, Marion, Miranda, and Miss McGraw, they are never found, and we never find out what happened to them. And through the course of this video, I will be talking as if we never do find out and speculating what I think it means and why. However, at the end of this video, I will be talking about the last chapter of the book that Joan Lindsay had written, which explained the disappearance. However, her editor had it removed. And so for most people who read the book or see the movie, it's a mystery as to what happens to them, but if you seek out this last chapter, you can find out. So I will be talking about that later in the video. And so to begin talking about just, the picnic and Hanging Rock itself. So Miss McGraw was a math teacher, as I said, and she was a very logical person. And in the book, as they are going to Hanging Rock, she is talking about how they can get home later, and she's comparing their path to a triangle, and the driver is just like, I have no idea what you're talking about, lady. Whereas in the movie, we do not hear this conversation. Instead, we see her looking, like studying a triangle while looking at the rock formation. And Hanging Rock seems to be a Bermuda Triangle of sorts. And the first time the Bermuda Triangle was written about was in 1964. So that very well could have been what Joan Lindsay was referencing with this. And also when they get to Hanging Rock, all of their clocks and watches stop working and time just feels so different when you're at Hanging Rock. And I love how we see this in the book. Time comes up so much in the book and the way it stretches and thins and all of that. But in the movie, I love it too, because when we're at Hanging Rock, it's this like dream-like state. And then we cut to Appleyard College and we very distinctly hear a clock ticking, signifying, the change of location and how starkly different these 2 places are. And how Hanging Rock doesn't abide by the laws of man, in a sense, right? Like it doesn't have the structure to its day based on the ticking of a clock, the way Appleyard College is structured in that way. But yeah, the 3 girls who end up going missing, Irma, she does return, but Marion, Miranda, and Irma, they decide they want to explore Hanging Rock. And they are joined by a younger girl named Edith who kind of tags along. And the higher the 4 girls go, the more uncomfortable Edith becomes. And as the others make their way higher, they take off their shoes and Edith becomes scared and uneasy for no apparent reason. And she screams before then running back to the picnic. And the other 3, they aren't uneasy at all, though. And it seems like they're kind of in a trance as they make their way further and further up. And I also love the shots, too, from within the rocks. And it makes it feel like the rock is looking back at them from, almost some kind of portal. You have the humans who are observing the rock, but the rock is also observing the humans. And when Edith is running back down to the picnic, she tells the cops later that as she was going down, she saw a pink cloud and she saw Miss McGraw going up, and Miss McGraw was not wearing her skirts. It was just her underclothing, which is an important detail I will be circling back to later. But yeah, while they are up in the rocks, Marion, she is looking down at her classmates and she says, "A surprising number of human beings are without purpose, though it is probable that they are performing some function unknown to themselves." And we see how out of place humans are here. For starters, in the movie specifically, seeing them hike while wearing this Victorian clothing just seems so out of place. But also how the animals in nature has a purpose, right? And yet the humans don't seem to have or know what their purpose is. And in the book we read, "Insulated from natural contacts with earth, air, and sunlight by corsets pressing on their solar plexus, by voluminous petticoats, cotton stockings, and kid boots, the drowsy, well-fed girls lounging in the shade were no more a part of their environment than figures in a photograph album, arbitrarily posed against a backcloth of cork rocks and cardboard trees." And I love how the book is constantly telling us what is going on with nature. It'll take breaks from talking about the humans and cut to what is happening with nature. And right at the very beginning of the book, when they arrive at Hanging Rock, we read, "Except for those people over there with the wagonette, we might be the only living creatures in the whole world," said Edith, airily dismissing the entire animal kingdom at one stroke. And this line also shows the pride of humans, right? Thinking that they are the only ones that matter and the natural animal world doesn't count. But another passage I liked is later on in the book. Again, she's been telling us about what is happening with the humans involved with the events at Hanging Rock. And then we read, the reader, taking a bird's eye view of events since the picnic, will have noted how various individuals on its outer circumference have somehow become involved in the spreading pattern. Mrs. Valange, Reg Lumley, Monsieur Louis Montpellier, Minnie and Tom, all of those lives have already been disrupted, sometimes violently. So too have the lives of innumerable lesser fry, spiders, mice, beetles, whose scuttlings, burrowings, and terrified retreats are comparable, if on a smaller scale. And we often read how Miranda, Marion, and Irma love nature and seem more in touch with it. And Miranda in particular is often associated with the swan in the eyes of Michael. And so that could be one reason why the rock calls to them. And yet Irma doesn't ultimately end up staying. And then also you have Miss McGraw, who isn't into nature at all, but rather she is very logical and into, mathematics and statistics. And so that is what causes her to be drawn to the rock. And then also the ones who stay, Marion, Miranda, and McGraw, their names all start with M. And I don't know what the significance of that is, but it does seem interesting, right? That they're all M's. And then also the fact that there were 4 of them, but one of them doesn't stick around. And the fact that triangles are associated with Hanging Rock, it made me wonder, were one of them not allowed because it could only be 3? Because a triangle only has, 3 points, 3 sides. So maybe there's something to that. But then also, Marion and Miranda are native to Australia, but Irma is not. So then there's that as well. But then Miss McGraw also is not native to Australia. But it's interesting because this book is very much about the Australian bush and it's a very Australian setting. And yet so many of the characters are transplants and not from Australia at all. And the only ones that are prominently featured that I'll be talking about are Bertie and Sara, and then Marion and Miranda. And so, so many central figures aren't even from Australia, and that seems significant because, being out of place in an unfamiliar world is definitely a theme here. And then to come back to the clothing, so as they climb higher up the rock, they take off their shoes and stockings, and then you have Miss McGraw, who had taken off her petticoat skirt things. And then when Irma is found, she is not wearing her corset. And we spend a lot of time in book and movie hearing about the clothing worn by the women and how strict the times were in being, fully clothed in this way and wearing the proper attire. And yet, as they get more in touch with the power of the rock, they take off these pieces of clothing that constrict them and that represent the strict Victorian era. And Mrs. Appleyard and her school, along with the clothing and Appleyard's strict adherence to how the girls present themselves, it's the opposite of what the rock represents and, the more natural world. And we read in the book, Appleyard College was already, in the year 1900, an architectural anachronism in the Australian bush, a hopeless misfit in time and place. And then later we read of Mrs. Appleyard, and now at last, after a lifetime of linoleum and asphalt and Axminster carpets, the heavy, flat-footed woman trod the springing earth. Born 57 years ago in a suburban wilderness of smoke-grimed bricks, she knew no more of nature than a scarecrow rigid on a broomstick above a field of waving corn. She who had lived so close to the little forest on the Bendigo Road had never felt the short, wiry grass underfoot, never walked between the straight, shaggy stems of the stringy bark trees. Never paused to savor the jubilant gusts of spring that carried the scent of wattle and eucalypt right into the front hall of the college. Never sniffed the foreboding blast of the north wind laden in summer with the fine ash of mountain fires. And to jump ahead a bit, so Mrs. Appleyard, as the college is continuing to go down the drain and she knows that she's going to lose it all, she goes to the rock. And that is the section I just read, is from when she is at the rock herself. But she isn't spirited away though, and instead she ends up falling to her death. But she did not go there to be in touch with nature or to try and even figure out what happened. Rather, I took it as her going there to confront the thing that she feels ruined her life. And she is so separate from the natural and spiritual world that she dies rather than be taken up by it the way the other characters were. And Appleyard, she's very focused on money and influence and power and reputation. And even the girls who go missing, she's not attached to them emotionally. She doesn't care about them. She just thinks to herself like, oh, like, why did it have to be those three? Because they came from such good families. Like, why couldn't it have been like one of these other three who don't matter so much? So she does not care at all about their well-being. She just cares how their disappearance is going to impact her life and her college. And there is a part where we read, this is from Appleyard's thoughts. Money is power, money is strength and safety. Even silence has to be paid for. So yeah, just further showing her attachment to things of the man-made world rather than being attached to things in the natural and spiritual world. Which brings me to Sara. So she was roommates with Miranda, and in the book, she was, I think, around 13, and she looked up to Miranda and loved her dearly. Whereas in the movie, Sara seems to be around the same age as Miranda. Like, I think she's a little bit younger, but still, she's closer in age, and the vibe in the movie made it seem like she was romantically in love with her. And yeah, she is heartbroken when Miranda goes missing and does not return. And Sara hadn't even gone to the picnic. She had to stay back because she had refused to memorize something and had wanted instead to recite something she had written herself. Appleyard, though, does not want to hear something original, but she wants to hear the assigned piece. And it's funny because Appleyard, she thinks this piece is written by the wrong author. And Sara knows that Appleyard is wrong. When she says the author, she's not even saying the right person. And so it shows how Appleyard isn't as smart as she thinks she is, I guess. But it also is telling the fact that Appleyard shuts down originality. And she's like, I don't want you writing your own stuff. Like, read and recite the project I told you to do. Like, don't write your own things. And yeah, Sara, I think, represents a pure love and an innocence, and yet she is used as a scapegoat by Appleyard as well as another junior teacher who straps her like to this thing that is supposed to help posture. Again, like literally representing the rigidity of the Victorian era and Appleyard College. And Sara, we also find out, is an orphan, and her guardian has not sent her recent payment for the following semester. And so Appleyard, she takes out her frustrations, like once the girls have gone missing, she takes out her frustrations on Sara and punishes her first by being like, you know, we haven't received a recent payment, so all of your extracurricular stuff is going to be cut. And Sara was in an art class, and so Appleyard is like, you can't take those art classes anymore. And in the book, the art teacher shows up only for Miss Appleyard to then send her away, being like, oh, Sara hasn't paid her fees, so you're not going to teach her anymore. And the art teacher is very upset about this, and she tells Sara, like, you're the only one here with any real talent. Like, we should be cultivating this, but instead I'm being sent away. And she even writes to Sara later being like, hey, if you need somewhere to go, you can come and stay with me. I will be happy to look after you. However, this letter never reaches Sara. And then near the end, Appleyard punishes Sara even further by telling her that she is going to be sent back to the orphanage. And we had just been hearing about what a horrible experience this was for Sara. So as soon as she is told this, we know what it means for her. And in the book, this is not in the movie, but in the book, after Sara goes missing, Mrs. Appleyard receives a letter from Sara's guardian being like, oh, hey, sorry, I was like out of the country or something. He was like, here's the check for the next semester. Sorry, it was delayed, blah, blah, blah. And so basically Miss Appleyard acted too quickly and was too extreme. And if she had just waited, Sara's payment would have come in. But ultimately, it almost like wasn't even about the payment. It was just about taking her anger out on Sara. But yeah, so she tells Sara that she has to go back to the orphanage, and then the next day Sara is missing, and Mrs. Appleyard tells the other teacher that Sara's guardian came to pick her up early that morning. But in the end of the book and movie, we see that Sara had jumped from her window and killed herself. But I did see people speculate in the film that Appleyard actually killed her. But in the book, we got a scene where after Sara had disappeared, Appleyard went into her room in the middle of the night and was looking around. And I took this as Appleyard trying to find evidence to be like, oh, like, where did she go? And so I think that tells us that she didn't kill Sara and that Sara killed herself. And yeah, Sara, again, she was just so sweet and innocent and kind and loving. And so the fact that she came from such a bad background too, right? So your heart already is going out to her. And then the fact that she dies in the end is so sad and tragic. And once her body is found, like that is the final nail in the coffin for the school. Like there's no coming back after that. Because people were already saying things like, oh, like the college is cursed because all of these negative things happening. And then, Sara dying was the final thing. And so then from there, Miss Appleyard, like I said, she goes to Hanging Rock herself. And I don't know if she committed suicide and purposefully fell or if she fell accidentally, but I would assume she committed suicide. But Sara's death also comes across as sacrificial since she did no wrong and she had such a sweet, pure love for Miranda. And Miranda is kind of the heart of the group who disappear. And if Sara has this deep connection with her, that makes Sara indirectly connected to Hanging Rock, a place that she herself never went. Plus, she, of course, has a connection to Albert, which we will get to. But yeah, it's interesting that she never even went to Hanging Rock, and yet she is so deeply connected to it and to the events and to the people. And then also throughout the book, Sara is associated with pansies because when her brother sees her ghost, that is what he smells. And then he and the gardener also mention at different points how she loves pansies. And then her body is found amongst the flowers. And so clearly, again, that theme of a character who is connected to nature and associated to nature versus the characters, again, like Appleyard, who are associated to man-made things. And yeah, I would love to know what you think Sara's death symbolizes down below in the comments. But to talk about Albert, so he is, like I said, he is the coachman that works for these relatives of Michael's, and he is the brother of Sara. So as kids, they lived in the orphanage, but then some guy adopted Sara, and that is when they were separated. And in both, the night Sara dies, her ghost visits Albert, or Bertie, as he is called. And so he has a dream where she visits him, and she says something like, oh, I've come such a long way to see you, but I need to go now. And then she gets misty and disappears. And this scene was so good in the book. And then in the movie, it was just absolutely incredible, partly because since I read the book, I knew that Sara had died, right? And that this was her ghost. But also just the performances are so incredible and the music and just everything is so amazing throughout this movie. And so the fact that this scene comes near the end after so much has happened, it just had such an emotional impact on me. And then to continue talking about Michael and Albert, so something that is not in the movie is that when Irma is revived, so Michael and Albert together help find Irma. And when she is revived, she and Michael start seeing each other. And they both come from very wealthy backgrounds. And so they make it's a perfect match. However, eventually, Michael loses interest in her, and it's when, he keeps telling her how great Albert is, and he wants Albert to meet Irma, but Albert doesn't want to. However, coincidentally, he ends up meeting her anyway. And then Michael and Irma are together when they see a swan, and swans represent Miranda to Michael. And so the swan maybe brings back the influence of the rock and makes him choose a different path, one that his heart was drawn to, rather than continuing to see Irma and marry her, which is what people suspected and hoped would happen. But after Michael and Irma part ways, Irma's father later sends Albert $1,000. And this is in 1900, so $1,000 was a huge amount of money. And so now that he is financially set, earlier Michael had told him that he was going to Queensland and he invited Albert to join him. And now that Albert has enough money, he writes to Michael saying that yeah, I'm gonna come with you. And we don't see this between the two men in the movie, but I did really like this ending for them and I really liked their dynamic. And maybe it's just me, but it definitely seemed like Albert and Michael were in love in the book. And in the end, it seems like both of them, by Albert agreeing to go with Michael is him following his heart's desire and being with Michael. And it's thanks to the picnic at Hanging Rock that he is able to do this, because he wouldn't have gotten the $1,000 if Irma never disappeared in the first place. And then, the way we read about the interaction Albert has with Irma and how he doesn't want to meet her, I thought maybe it seemed like he was jealous of her, and that's why there was this weird tension there. And then also, Irma, she tells Michael, oh, I met your friend Albert. And Michael is his face brightens up and he's like, oh, wasn't he great? Didn't you love him? He was fantastic. And Irma is so confused, being like, wow, I don't see what he sees in that guy, but, whatever. And so, again, let me know if you've read the book. Let me know if you felt this in the subtext or not. But I like to think that they were in love and they went off together in the end. And it all happened thanks to Hanging Rock. But in the movie, I do love, and this is true to the book too, I do love how we see how haunted Michael is by the missing girls and how he is drawn to the rock, and it has this hypnotizing effect on him as well. And I also really liked the chemistry between the two actors here, and while I don't think there is any romance in the film, I still liked their portrayals. And again, they had so many just emotional scenes. And this is one of the things that reminded me of Twin Peaks, like seeing how people are hit by the death of Laura Palmer and just the emotion. And it doesn't feel like it's kind of extreme, but it doesn't feel over the top or silly or anything. It just feels so genuine and painful. And that's how it felt with Michael, like the impact of the disappearance of those girls and how it totally like shakes him. And then again, how Albert is affected by it too. And yeah, I just loved it. But it's interesting too, because the relationship between Sara and Miranda kind of mirror the relationship between Michael and Albert. You know, for one, Sara and Albert happen to be brother and sister, but then Miranda and Michael both come from wealthy families. And yeah, both pairs have this love between the two of them. But then also I wanted to point out how Michael, again, he comes from a very strict English Victorian background. And yet we have a moment in the film I love where he's with his, proper English group and they're witnessing some concert, but he leaves the concert instead to come hang out in the shack with Albert, right? So he is abandoning this, the decorum of the English proper gentleman era, and he would rather be living the life that Albert's living, and that's the company he would rather keep. And so unlike Appleyard, who embraces and clings to the rigidity of these rules and structure, unlike her, Michael abandons that, right? And so that is one reason why maybe, the rock, he passed out on the rock and he could have died had Albert not found him. And yet at the same time, he didn't die and he ended up finding Irma. But yeah, and so while Appleyard and he both went to the rock, they went for different reasons. And where Appleyard died, Michael did not. But it's also interesting because the disappearance of the girls happens on Valentine's Day. And this is a big deal to the girls in the college because they love Valentine's Day and they're all writing love notes to each other. And they make a point to say how there's only 2 men at the college and they're not the ones sending love notes. So it's all the girls sending love notes to each other. And so they make this huge deal about Valentine's Day, and at the picnic they have a cake and they toast to St. Valentine. And then also when Irma comes to see the girls after her return, she is wearing bright red, which in my mind, I associate that with Valentine's Day. But it could also signify her departure from the strictness of Appleyard College. And also Miss Appleyard, she did not like Valentine's Day. She found it ridiculous. And so that too, embracing Valentine's Day is one way to rebel against these strict Victorian rules and to rebel against Mrs. Appleyard. But yeah, and they wear, these bland colors when they're in school. And yet she shows up back to the school wearing bright red. And then all of the girls harass her and they're like, what happened to Miranda? What happened? You know the truth. And they're like tormenting her. And what stops them is one of the girls in the book, she says a prayer to St. Valentine. And that is what calms everybody down. And I wanted to read this section of the book. Rosamund, who had taken no part in all this, was praying to St. Valentine. He was the only saint she was acquainted with, and so quite rightly she prayed to him. Miranda had loved St. Valentine. Miranda believed in the power of love over everything. St. Valentine, I don't know how to pray to you properly. Dear St. Valentine, make them leave Irma alone and love one another for Miranda's sake. Not often, surely, is the good St. Valentine, traditionally concerned with the lesser frivolities of romantic love, offered a prayer of such innocent urgency. And then it's interesting, too, to think about the Christian themes going on, because this is Saint Valentine, like he was originally a Christian figure. And Miranda, as we read right there, she loved Valentine's Day, and she was such a big proponent of Valentine's Day. And again, I love that quote where it says she believed in the power of love over everything. And then also in the prayer, she asked, stop them from tormenting Irma for Miranda's sake. And so in some ways, Miranda is almost like a Christ figure, and her presence brings quote unquote disciples to her. And she even tells Sara at the start that she needs to love others and not just her because she will be leaving soon. And Christ also told his apostles that he was going to leave soon, shortly before he died. And then also as the girls go higher and higher up the mountain, they become more in touch with whatever it is that is drawing them to it, right? And this also has religious significance because often we hear of prophets and people going high up into a mountain to talk to God, right? Like Moses, he goes up to the top of a mountain to get the 10 Commandments. But then also the fact that their bodies are never found, we never know what happened to them. And that too, we hear of prophets who like just go walking off and are just taken up to heaven and they never experience physical death. So you could see maybe that's what happened to the girls too, you know? And then repressed sexuality is also always a theme in anything that takes place in the Victorian era because it was such a strict, rigid time to be living in. And in the film, there is a maid and a guy who work at the college who are in a relationship and they are having sex. And we have a scene when we see an apple with a bite taken out of it before panning to them in bed, clearly referencing Adam and Eve eating the apple. And then we also get a conversation between these two where the woman, she's like, oh, I feel sorry for the girls. And the guy is like, oh, the girls who went missing. And she says, oh, yeah, like them too. But I was talking about the girls in the college. And so I loved that part because the ones who are left behind are the ones who are struggling, whereas the ones who have disappeared, it seems like maybe they're in a better place now in one way or another. And so it's the ones who are still behind that are struggling more, the ones who are still in this rigid Victorian society who have not yet gotten away from it, you know? And she is specifically referencing Sara, right? Again, and Sara is the scapegoat who suffers the most in all of this, I would say. But then also there is a doctor, and every time he inspects one of the girls, for example, Edith, because she had been, you know, part of the disappearance sort of, and so a doctor looks her over. But then also when Irma returns, he makes sure and tells them like, oh, like, don't worry, she's still intact, meaning she is still a virgin, because at that time, a woman's virginity was like the most important thing about her. And this is a quote I just really liked, and so I wanted to share it, and I think it kind of fits in this discussion. So it's from a blog post I read that was talking about this movie, and they say, in the 1001 Movies summary that originally captured my attention, the film is described as a ghost story without ghosts, a puzzle without a solution, and a story of sexual repression without sex. No dream is fulfilled, every human urge is stifled, and in the end, all we are left with is the cruel loss without any explanation. This all-pervasive absence is, to me, what sets Picnic apart as a remarkable film. And so, yeah, in my mind, I see the girls who have disappeared, like I said, they're doing better than those who have left behind. And that's where the real tragedy is those who are still stuck living in this time and place and haven't escaped. But to talk about the author's explanation. So when she originally submitted this manuscript, she had a final chapter which explained what happened to those who disappeared. However, her editor told her to cut that. And so certain elements from the final chapter were placed in chapter 3 of the book, but any concrete explanation was removed. And also, in the beginning of the original manuscript, Joan Lindsay had a section that read, "Whether Picnic at Hanging Rock is fact or fiction or both, my readers must decide for themselves." However, the editor, he had her get rid of the "or both" part, so then it just says, "Whether this is fact or fiction, my readers can decide." And so, because no explanation is given, and because we have this intro, people thought that this was based on a true story. And so after this book came out, so many people were in a frenzy trying to look over historical documents and researching to see if this is based on a real disappearance and trying to get answers. And I think it was genius on the editor's part to not have an explanation because, first of all, it creates an open loop in your mind where you can't stop thinking about it because an explanation would close the loop, right? But because none is given, you just keep going on around and you can't stop thinking about it because you want to try to figure out what happened to them. And yeah, throughout Lindsay's life, she never revealed to the public or to the director because he asked her what happened to them? She was like, I'm not answering that. I don't know, whatever you think. And so she never revealed to the public what this final chapter was. However, there's a guy who worked at her publishing house and she gave him this unprinted chapter and she told him that she wanted it published once she had died. So I thought that was really interesting. But I went, and you can find this unpublished chapter in a book called The Secret of Hanging Rock. And so I did read it for myself. And so in this chapter, we begin with this quote. It is happening now, as it has been happening ever since Edith Horton ran stumbling and screaming towards the plane, as it will go on happening until the end of time. The scene is never varied by so much as the falling of a leaf or the flight of a bird. To the four people on the rock, it is always acted out in the tepid twilight of a present without a past. Their joys and agonies are forever new. And this, I just love that so much, and it fits so well with, like I said, throughout this book and movie, time is not normal, right? And it sort of reminded me of the book Annihilation as well, where time has no meaning, right? And something is forever happening. And yeah, it's just so trippy and weird. But yeah, so anyway, so in this final chapter, the three girls, Miriam, Irma, and Miranda, they are climbing up to Hanging Rock, or hiking up, and when they reach the top, they see a woman up there, and it is Miss McGraw. However, they do not recognize her, and she does not recognize them. Like, they have a moment where they're like, I think I know you. You seem familiar, and yet they're already in this trippy reality where they don't recognize her. But she is very uncomfortable and struggling, and so they take her corset off in order to free her. And after they take her corset off, all of them are like, let's all take them off. And so they all take off their corsets, and one of them is going to throw it over the rock. But when she throws them, they instead float in the air. And then from here, a wormhole opens up, and we read of Miss McGraw. She had passed a lifetime asking questions, and now they were answered, simply by looking at the hole. It faded out, and at last she was at peace. And so yeah, this explains why Miss McGraw is drawn to it, because this wormhole is this like weird anomaly, and her mathematical, logical, scientific brain was drawn to it. And so she goes in first, and then Marion goes in. And then when it's Miranda's turn, Irma suddenly gets scared, and she's like, oh, like, don't go in. Like, why don't we just go back? But Miranda, she's like, what do you mean? Like, of course I'm going to go in. And so Miranda then goes in the wormhole, and then Irma is left just like staring down into the wormhole for an unknown amount of time before it then closes, and then she is found by Michael. So I guess she was kind of in this weird plane of existence for about a week, because it's a week later that Michael goes up and he ends up finding her. And I think it's just so cool to have this weird sci-fi ending take place in a book that's set in this Victorian era. Like, it feels so out of place, and yet because of that, it works so well. And yet, when you don't have this ending, throughout the book and movie, you are still getting this like weird sci-fi, otherworldly vibe throughout the story. And because we are not ever explicitly told that it is a sci-fi event that takes place, I think it just creates all the more intrigue in the book and movie. And also, I think maybe this kind of ending in a movie and the book would maybe be too much for people and too weird, and they would end up leaving the movie and the book being like, oh, it was great up until the end. But because we never get that concrete ending, people can't be disappointed. Granted, people are still disappointed that no answer is given, and yet it doesn't feel like a cheat. Like, it doesn't feel like we were cheated out of an answer. It seems like just so fitting that we never got an answer. So it works so well not having this final chapter, and yet I am glad I have read it. And it's funny because, yeah, Peter Weir, he did not know about this chapter when he made the film, and yet he still made the right guesses based on what we are given in the book, because the film is so sci-fi-esque despite it not being sci-fi in any direct way. Yeah, it seems so clear in the film that they weren't kidnapped, they didn't die, and that something otherworldly happened to them. Like, it seems so obvious even if we're not told it specifically. And in the book, too, we often hear about the spreading shadow of events of Picnic at Hanging Rock and how it touches and changes the lives of so many. And this, too, gives one the feeling that something greater is taking hold and changing the course of so many lives with its pervasive influence. Like, it is sucking so many people into its grasp, even if it doesn't take them with it the way it did take the three who never returned. But real quick before wrapping up, I wanted to mention, so I said that 3 people died in the book because the woman who strapped Sara to the table, in the movie, she gives Miss Appleyard her resignation, but in the book, her brother shows up, tells Miss Appleyard that his sister is quitting, and then the two of them leave. And that night they are staying at an inn, And in their room, they leave the lamp out and it ends up tipping over and the hotel burns and they die. And yeah, this teacher and then the French teacher, who I didn't even talk about, they're interesting too because they're polar opposites, because the one who dies, she is more like Appleyard, where she is very rigid and strict, and also she is very mean to Sara, whereas the French teacher is so kind and loving and sweet. And also the French teacher is beloved by the girls, whereas people don't like this other teacher. And then to move on to book versus movie. So yeah, I loved this book so much. The writing is so beautiful and powerful and evocative. And at times it's funny while also being, at other times being so tragic and horrible. And yet it's also can be so sweet. And I watched the movie maybe like 2 days after I read the book. And like I said, I loved the book and it was impactful. But then after I watched the movie, like the movie really sucked me in and really grabbed me. And then I watched it during the day and then I watched other things afterwards. And yet that night, like all of my dreams were about the movie Picnic at Hanging Rock. And I just love what they did with it. It's just so incredible. They were able to give it this weird magical realism sci-fi vibe, even though we don't see anything that is straight up sci-fi, like it's all in the atmosphere and the ambience and the undertones. And the music is incredible too. Like the score just really adds to it. And I also love the visuals at times. Like I said, those shots from within the rock. But then also there's a great scene where Michael, he is up in the middle of the night in his bed and we see that he thinks he sees a swan sitting on the edge of his bed. And again, swans represent Miranda, which by the way, there's a part in a book where she says something about how like in the middle of the night is the times when like certain things happen that are so unknown. I'm messing up the quote. But anyway, we see that in the film because, again, this scene with Michael in the middle of the night, and then we go to other characters who are all awake in bed in the middle of the night, and they're all thinking of Hanging Rock and the events that happened there. And so, yeah, I would say that as much as I love the book, I would say that the movie wins because, yeah, like after I finished it, I was thinking it would be a 4.5, but as time has gone on, it just has grown on me more and more, and I just can't let it go. And just like the characters who were sucked in by the mystery of Hanging Rock and sucked in by its allure and, this magnetism it has that draws them to it. Like I've just been drawn to it and I can't let it go, just like the characters can't let it go. And yeah, it was just so incredible. They did a great job adapting this, and I still love the book and would highly, highly recommend it. And yet, yeah, I think the movie wins out just by a tad. So yeah, these were both fantastic. Again, if you are the one who recommended it to me, comment down below, and thank you again for suggesting this. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.